Welcome to this Killick Explains video, and welcome to part 2 of what may turn out to be a longish series called Investing Under Trump. And this one is all about why tariffs are so controversial. All right. Now, tariffs, split opinion, but why? Okay, so the background with all these videos is, I don't need to tell you now that Donald Trump was elected on a program of change, and boy, has he been changing things. Executive orders being signed left, right and centre. One of his bigger targets was tariffs. In other words, the cost of American goods or goods being imported into the US from other economies around the world, including Europe, including China, and possibly the sort of apex of his thinking was Liberation Day, as it was called, when he came out with that slightly odd clipboard full of tariffs to be imposed on other economies all around the world, and virtually no one escaped. The reason he could do it so fast is he's invoked emergency powers, all right, and created a fair amount of market turmoil along the way. All right, so what's going on here? So first of all, tariffs. I mean, it's a word that's all over the press, has been for months now. Tariffs are basically levies set at different percentages on goods and services imported into the US. Now, anybody, any economy can impose tariffs, but the American version is saying, right, we look around the world, we say all these economies have been able to sell to US consumers far too cheaply. They've been exploiting US consumers. This is the Trump argument, all right? That's resulted in parts of the US economy kind of vanishing as things are done cheaper overseas. So enough, all right? What we're going to do is basically increase the cost for people selling to these generous, deep-pocketed US consumers. So it's basically a percentage, 10, 100 added, straight line addition to the cost of doing business with the US. Not the same as tax, just a technical point. This is not VAT, all right? That's a UK value-added sales tax, all right? But what it does do is boost, as I say, the cost potentially of trying to deal with the US consumer, because what Trump's trying to do is discourage American consumers from buying overseas products at these new, more expensive rates and potentially buy at home or from somewhere else instead. Make America great. Now, there were lots of different tariff rates. I won't go through the whole lot here. As I sit and make this video, the UK has struck a deal, okay, the first deal of its kind on a selective range of tariffs. So the negotiations continue, but nonetheless, it doesn't look like they're going away anytime soon. Now, the UK was not Trump's primary target, quite clearly. Beijing and China was, all right? So what's he trying to do there? Now, when it comes to China, we're not talking 10 or 20%. Tariffs at the time I'm making this video have gone well over 100%, which is an enormous increase in the cost, basically, of US imports from China. So what's he trying to do there? In a nutshell, he's trying to reduce the amount of stuff that US companies and consumers buy from China. What he thinks that'll do is boost manufacturing in the US, because if it's really expensive to buy stuff from places like China, then American companies and international companies will base their operations in the US. They'll reshore, if you like, and try and do it in the US. And that will benefit everybody. That will create local jobs, boost local economies, okay, and make life easier for US consumers, is the theory. So basic aims can be summed up as part of making America great again, stop the exploitation of the American consumer, if you like, regenerate areas that have seen, steel disappear in America, for example, regenerate those areas, rebuild inside the US, encourage much more American self-sufficiency. The Americans have a history of isolationism, a history of going it alone if you go back far enough, and he thinks it's fairer. Right? Why should all these overseas firms be able to sell stuff cheaply into the US? He's sort of got a conceptual point there, but what's actually happened? So what have tariffs actually done? Okay, and the answer is sown a fair amount of chaos. All right, straight away, China retaliated. That was fairly predictable, and said, well, okay, if you're going to impose tariffs on stuff we're sending to you, we'll do the reverse. All right, even though there may be an imbalance there, we'll do the reverse. Europe has also had to retaliate. As I make this video, deals are being cut one by one with Trump, but that's what's happened so far. And supply chains, in some cases, almost ground to a halt as companies panicked and thought, crikey, what are we going to do if suddenly the cost of sending stuff to the US increases dramatically. And as for the reshoring argument, well, companies are sort of saying, you know, how's that going to work? In order to build plant in the US that was in the Philippines, for argument's sake, we need a decade. We've got to rehire, all right? There's huge capital expenditure commitments. This is not stuff that can just happen overnight. So a certain amount of chaos has reigned, all right? More than that, some companies are being quite creative and far from what Trump's expecting and saying, well, okay, the tariffs are fine, we'll just suffer those tariffs, we'll just accept that our products are now going to be more expensive to ship to US consumers. They've been creative like companies do. So Apple have said things like, maybe we could rebase some of our manufacturing in a lower cost country like India, for argument's sake, okay? And the other impacts are sort of been unintended probably for Donald Trump. Tariffs are inflationary. Naturally, if you increase the price of a good or service by 100% into America, that imports inflation into the US. It hits profits for globalized US companies, and I'll come back to that in a future video. There's even a rumor it could trigger a recession, although jobs data does seem to be reasonably robust at the time of this video being made in the US. And frankly, most people are looking at it and saying, Donald Trump, you cannot do this for too long. It's an old world solution. Globalization is a horse that has already bolted. You can't turn back the clock by randomly imposing tariffs. So, what are tariffs? They're probably a very elaborate negotiating ploy. It's Trump's equivalent of nicking your lunch money, all right, and then giving you some of it back in return for favours. But there we are. Now, this is a theme that will run and run for the time being. If you'd like a bit more information about some of the terms I just mentioned, then try out the resources section of our website, where you'll find other Killick Explains videos, the guides, the equities one is relevant here, and of course, Confidant.